Hey guys, tonight, we begin with the utterly reckless, occasionally poetic and often puke-covered experience of getting wasted in medieval times. When alcohol wasn't just for fun, it was safer than the water, more reliable than a doctor, and significantly cheaper than a confession. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're at, tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us. From around the world, now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're a peasant in the 13th century Europe. You've been working the fields since sunrise. You're caked in mud. Your back hurts, and you're parched. But instead of reaching for a glass of water, you do something your modern descendants would find deeply alarming. You reach for a tankard of ale, and not because you're trying to get tipsy. No, it's because water could kill you. Medieval people had a healthy, well-earned paranoia of untreated water rivers, and wells were convenient dumping grounds for sewage-dead animals. And the occasional unlucky traveler germ theory didn't exist yet. But people had figured out through trial and very unfortunate error that drinking straight from the stream was a shortcut to spending the night with your face in a ditch or in a shallow grave. The solution: small beer, a low-alcohol, mildly fermented drink made from grains, barley, and whatever yeast happened to be floating around it. Wasn't glamorous. It wasn't strong, but it was safer than the plague-ridden puddle outside. Children drank it. Nuns drank it. Even monks drank it. Though, to be fair, they probably had better stuff. The average medieval person consumed about a gallon of ale per day. That's right, a gallon. Not because they were all raging alcoholics, though, let's be honest. Some were, but because they genuinely didn't trust water. It was also cheaper and easier to produce than wine, especially in Northern Europe. In many places, ale wasn't just a drink. It was a food group, a calorie delivery system in a cup, liquid bread if you will, and far less chewable than the moldy stuff the local miller passed off as food. And no, people weren't staggering around drunk all day. The alcohol content in small beer was usually 1 to 2%. Just enough to kill bacteria, not enough to start a tavern brawl before breakfast. But if you drank too much, especially on an empty stomach, things got wobbly while peasants were chugging low-grade ale to avoid dying from swamp water. Monks were doing something a little more refined, inventing medieval craft beer. Yes, in between. Chanting, copying manuscripts, and regretting their celibacy. Monks were quietly becoming the OG brewmasters of Europe, far from being casual drinkers. They ran full-on brewing operations in their monasteries, and they were good at it, really good. Why monks? Well, monasteries were clean, relatively stable and full of men with time literacy and access to big pots. Brewing became part of the monastic routine, just like praying, fasting, and passive-aggressively judging each other's handwriting. They brewed for guests, for pilgrims, for charity, and of course, for themselves. Let's not pretend Brother Pius wasn't sneaking a pint between Vespers and Matins. They also perfected recipes, unlike peasants, who just tossed grains in a pot and hoped for the best. Monks documented everything. They measured ingredients. They timed fermentation. They even introduced hops to the process. Yes, hops, the plant that gives beer its bitterness and lets you pretend your IPA addiction is sophisticated. And while regular folks were drinking small beer, monks brewed stronger stuff. Why? Because they could also. Because during fasting periods, solid food was banned, but beer wasn't. This brilliant theological loophole gave rise to what monks lovingly called liquid bread. It had calories, it had flavor, it had alcohol. What more does a cloistered man need? Some monasteries got so good at it that their beer became famous across regions' towns. People would visit the abbey, not for spiritual enlightenment, but for the booze. By the 14th century, many monasteries were running what we'd now call microbreweries. Except, instead of a guy named Chad in a flannel shirt, it was Brother Gregory with a toner and impeccable fermentation notes. Monastic beer became a brand. Even today, several beers still carry names tied to old monasteries, proving that holy men really understood the sacred relationship between man and mug. Before Instagram, before Facebook, and long before you could ruin your reputation. With a tweet, there were taverns, and in medieval times, taverns were where everything happened. Weddings were planned. There, deals were made. There, fights broke out there, and yes, people got properly, gloriously, biblically drunk there. Taverns were the medieval answer to both the office and the town square. You went there to hear news, gossip about your neighbors, argue about taxes, and occasionally find out if someone had been secretly excommunicated. It was basically a medieval Reddit thread, except with more beer and slightly fewer trolls. Slightly, the interior was simple. A dirt or straw-covered floor, rough wooden benches, an open hearth, and a tavern keeper who may or may not have cleaned the mugs this week. The air was thick with smoke, garlic, and regret. And on busy nights, you might find traveling musicians' dice games or an impromptu pig auction. Taking place between rounds, the drink menu, modest, usually ale, maybe cider, and if you were lucky or rich, a bit of wine. But no one came for the variety. They came for the chaos. And in a society where most people worked from dawn to dusk in back-breaking conditions, a tavern was more than a drinking hole, it was a pressure valve. It's also where social boundaries blurred temporarily. In the tavern, peasants could bump shoulders with merchants. Clergy might share a bench with the town blacksmith. And occasionally someone might start speaking Latin after 2 cups, and no one would stop them. Everyone was equal under ale until someone knocked over a jug. Then all hell broke loose. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Church leaders complained that taverns were dens of sin, and city councils tried regulating them with about as much success as regulating pigeons. But the truth was simple. Taverns were essential. They kept communities together, let steam blow off, and gave people a place to lose arguments. Money and memory all in one night in medieval Europe. How drunk you got and how much dignity you lost in the process often depended on your social class. Because getting wasted wasn't a one-size-fits-all experience. It came in tiers, like a really unstable wedding cake with a goat sleeping under it. Let's start at the bottom. The peasant, your average village laborer, drank small beer or weak cider throughout the day. Not to party, but to stay alive. It was a calorie source, a water substitute. And frankly, one of the few affordable pleasures in a life full of blisters and taxes. Peasants drank from wooden cups, clay jugs, or if things got really desperate, their hands getting wasted wasn't always the goal. But on feast days, you could count on someone waking up in a haystack with no memory and someone else's shoe. Now slide up the muddy social ladder to the nobility. Here alcohol was about status. Nobles drank wine, ideally imported absurdly expensive, and served in a goblet that could double as a helmet. Wine was often sweetened, spiced, or perfumed because nothing says power, like drinking something that smells like your grandmother's closet. Feasts in noble courts were liquid marathons, multiple courses, endless refills and toasts that went on so long you could grow a beard. Mid-sentence getting drunk at court was common, even expected, but it had to be done gracefully slurred. Latin and wine-stained robes, forgivable throwing up on the bishop's lap, slightly less so, Then there were the monks and clergy floating in their own bubble, technically celibate, occasionally sober monasteries brewed beer, but the priests drank wine for sacramental purposes. Of course, which is a polite way of saying they were usually tipsy by vespers, but whether peasant or noble, the one universal rule was, don't waste it. Alcohol was valuable. Every drop came from labor, fermented, stored, and hauled by someone who'd rather be napping. You drank what you had, and you respected it, or you got in a fight with the baker and ended up in the stocks. Drinking was the medieval equalizer. It dulled misery for the poor and inflated egos for the rich. Everyone got something out of it. Some got hangovers, some got legends. So you might be wondering, what exactly did medieval people drink when they wanted to unwind or just survive another day of plowing plague or papal taxes? Let's begin with ale, the true backbone of the medieval beverage lineup. It was unfiltered, uncarbonated, and often thick enough to chew, brewed from barley oats, or whatever grain hadn't been stolen by rats. That week, ale came in multiple strengths: small beer light, regular ale, buzzworthy, and the kind that made you see angels or start reciting poetry. Sometimes both. Next was me, the drink of choice for those who wanted to feel a bit mythological, made from fermented honey and water. It was sweet, strong, and popular at feasts, or among people who thought regular beer just wasn't theatrical enough. If Ale was the village plumber, me was the bard with the lute and questionable eye contact. Then came wine, mostly for the rich, the monks, and anyone living in southern Europe where grapes were more plentiful than morels. But medieval wine was a far cry from your modern Merlot. It was often sour weak and routinely mixed with herbs, spices, or even sea-ader. Yes, sea-ader. Nothing says, I'm classy, like sipping a Cabernet that tastes like brine. And regret, you also had cider and perry-fermented apple, or pear drinks, popular in orchard regions. Sweet, fizzy-ish, and dangerously easy to overdrink, especially if you were already 2 tankers deep into your no-work-today plan. And then things got weird. Some folks drank bracket, a medieval hybrid of beer and mead usually strong enough to peel paint. Others enjoyed set a bizarre hot mixture of curdled milk and ale. Picture a foamy soup made by someone who's angry at cows. Occasionally, medicinal concoctions came into play, herb-infused wines that promised to cure everything from headaches to demons. Whether they actually cured anything is questionable. But after 3 cups, no one cared. And finally, there was ale mixed with raw egg for the brave and the soon to be nauseous. Did it help with strength? Maybe did it smell like something you'd regret? Absolutely. If you think medieval people drank a lot during regular days, you should see them at a feast. These weren't your grandma's polite dinners. They were all-night carnivals of consumption. Meat music, merntimement, and massive quantities of booze, and getting drunk wasn't just accepted, it was basically built into the seating arrangement. Feasts happened for any occasion: weddings, holidays, the birth of a royal heir, the return of someone who hadn't died from crusading, or just because the Lord was bored and wanted to show off his new goblet shaped like a falcon. The drinking began. Early wine or strong ale was poured by the gallon, and guests were expected to participate enthusiastically. Refusing a toast could be seen as rude, suspicious, or even unpatriotic. In some courts, it was practically treason. Toasts weren't just cheers, they were elaborate rituals with speeches, blessings, and the occasional passive-aggressive poem. And every toast was followed by more food, more drink, and usually more bad decisions. Nobles drank from ornate cups, gold, silver, sometimes carved horn, because even intoxication had to be a performance. Meanwhile, servants scurried around refilling mugs, clearing trenches, aka edible plates made of stale bread, and quietly judging everyone as the evening dragged on. and inhibitions vanished. The party often devolved into a blur of singing wrestling and long-winded storytelling. No one asked for, there are medieval records of people dueling mid-fold. A better joke, or whose beard had more dignity. And then came the entertainers, minstrels, dancers, jugglers, or that one guy who made inappropriate shadow puppets. After too much me, all fueled by the same overflowing pitches. If things went well, you left wobbling full of roast goose and good cheer. If they went poorly, you woke up under the table next to a jester and a broken lute swearing you'd never drink again until next week. Feasts were structured chaos and alcohol. It was the social glue and the accelerant. If you thought beer pong was the peak of human civilization. Allow me to introduce you to the chaotic world of medieval drinking games, where the stakes were high, the rules were vague, and the chance of injury hovered somewhere around absolutely getting wasted wasn't just a side effect of medieval socializing. It was the main event, and games helped move things along. These weren't structured contests with scorecards. No, these were activities that started with laughter and ended with someone passed out in the turnip bin. One of the most common pastimes toasting wars, two or more people would try to out-toast each other, not in clever words, but in sheer volume. It was less about poetry and more about surviving round after round without slurring through the words to the king's goat. Another classic was casting the dice, often played for drinks, coins, or questionable favors. The dice were crude, often carved from bone, and the rules changed depending on who was sober enough to explain them. And if the game ended in an accusation of cheating, well, congratulations, you just invented medieval bar fighting, which we'll cover later. There was also who can drink the most, the fastest, not a creative name, but extremely popular. This was less about winning and more about achieving bragging rights and possibly liver failure. Medieval men prided themselves on how many tankers they could down before falling into a hedge in noble circles. Drinking games were wrapped in rituals and manners. Like courtly pledges, a lady might challenge a knight to drink a full goblet in her honor, a task he'd accept dramatically, possibly while composing a short epic poem and trying not to belch through the rhyming couplets. And of course, there were games with physical consequences, balance contests, spinning challenges, and impromptu wrestling. Once someone mistook the minstrel for an ogre, the point was never really to win. The point was to drink more, laugh harder, and test the durability of the local furniture in medieval Europe. Drinking wasn't just socially acceptable, it was theologically endorsed. The church may have wagged its finger at taverns and bar fights, but when it came to wine, that was holy business. Let's start with the basics. Communion wine at every Mass. The priest would lift the chalice, say a few sacred words, and boom, it was now the literal blood of Christ. And then he drank it often, several times a week, sometimes daily. Now it's not like priests were doing keg stands in the cathedral, but the ritual meant a steady, respectable intake of wine, all in the name of salvation. And wine wasn't reserved just for communion. Monasteries produced barrels of the stuff, technically for religious use, but somehow always with enough left over for, let's say, personal reflection. Monks documented their vintages, praised the divine quality of fermentation, and occasionally ended sermons a bit slurred. Then you had saints who were practically the patron protectors of partying. Saint Bridget of Ireland once prayed for a lake of beer for the heavenly host. And yes, that's a real quote. Saint Arnold of Soissons is said to have saved thousands by urging people to drink beer instead of water. During a plague science, no accidentally correct. Absolutely, even religious festivals doubled as excuses to drink Christmas, Easter. Saints' days. They weren't just for praying. They were for feasting, singing and warming your soul, and bloodstream with ale or mead. Pilgrims often stopped at monasteries where monks offered hospitality in the form of bread shelter and just enough wine to make the next leg of the journey spiritually questionable. And if you passed out under the altar table, well, you were just resting in the presence of the Lord. Of course, the Church condemned excessive drinking, but like most medieval rules, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. A noble might get a stern sermon, a peasant might get tossed in the stocks. A monk, he'd just get reassigned to less liquid duties. Let's be honest, in a world where beer was safer than water, someone was always bound to overdo it. And while medieval society loved a good feast and a bit of booze-fueled cheer, there was a limit. Once you crossed the line from merrily tipsy to shouting at goats and trying to joust a fence, that's when the town stocks came into play. Yes, the dreaded stocks. Medieval society's favorite blend of punishment and public entertainment. These wooden contraptions clamped your ankles, wrists, or neck and left you stuck in the village square exposed to the elements. Hecklers, and occasionally a very disappointed sheep getting put in the stocks for public drunkenness, wasn't rare if you were loud rude, vomited somewhere sacred or strategic, or decided to moon a local bishop. You might find yourself clamped into public humiliation. By dawn, the punishment wasn't just physical, it was deeply social. Your friends, neighbors, and that one nosy blacksmith's wife all got to watch you squirm, stew, and sober up slowly. In full daylight, children might throw old vegetables, monks might mutter scripture at you. Someone would definitely say, "Seen that one before." Ironically, you weren't always punished for drinking, only for being bad at it. Nobles could drink themselves into a coma at feasts with no consequences. But if a cobbler tripped into a pig trough after 3 ales, suddenly it was a moral crisis. Authorities saw public drunkenness as dangerous, not because of the alcohol itself, but because it made people unpredictable. Slurred speech and stumbling were fine behind closed doors. But out in the streets, that's how revolts start, or worse. Folk songs, some towns even had ale tasters, whose job was to make sure tavern beer wasn't too strong, or at least not stronger than the mayor's tolerance. Still, being drunk in public was rarely treated as a crime. It was a mild disgrace, a social slap on the wrist. You weren't a criminal, just someone who got a little too medieval on a Wednesday night. And after a few hours in the stocks, you walked away, stiff-shamed, and probably planning your next visit to the tavern just quieter this time. Hangovers in the Middle Ages were exactly as awful as you'd expect, minus the ibuprofen, and minus any sympathy from your neighbors. You wake up on a pile of straw. The church bells are going off like Judgment Day, and there's a goat staring at you because apparently you passed out in its stall again. So what did medieval people do for hangovers? Well, for starters, they powered through it. You had chores, you had obligations, you didn't have time to complain about your head splitting open like a rotting melon. You just muttered something about sin and staggered back into the daylight. But some people, bless them, did try actual cures. One popular one, raw eggs and ale, because nothing says recovery like mixing what wrecked you with what might give you salmonella. Others swore by vinegar, or fennel tea, or infused herbs which usually tasted like grass and sadness. If you were lucky enough to have access to a doctor, and I use that term loosely, they'd talk about imbalanced humors and probably bleed you a little. Nothing helps a hangover, like blood loss. Right? Some just kept drinking. That's not a joke. Hair of the dog wasn't invented yesterday. Medieval folks figured, well, I already feel like death, might as well top it off with a warm mug of redemption. The church predictably had a different take. Hangovers weren't just your body punishing you. They were God punishing you. The prescription was repentance and maybe fasting, Nothing cures a headache like guilt and a dry crust of bread. Honestly, most people probably didn't call it a hangover. They just called it Thursday. But make no mistake, getting wasted in medieval times had consequences. The difference is, you couldn't tweet about it. You just got up, wiped the ale crust off your face, and hoped nobody remembered what you did with that loot. At some point in history, someone invented alcohol, and about 5 minutes later, someone else got punched in the face with a mug. Welcome to the chaotic world of medieval bar fights, where your honor, your drink, and your questionable singing voice could all get you into trouble. Taverns were not quiet places. They were loud, smoky, smelly, and usually packed to the rafters with people who'd spent all day digging trenches, shoeing horses, or arguing with their landlord, and were now three-alzied over just about anything: spilled drinks, unpaid debts, dice games gone wrong, who had the better beard, who insulted whose ox, and occasionally because someone thought the other guy looked too French. That was an actual insult in certain towns. Weapons weren't supposed to be brought into taverns, but let's be honest, this rule was as effective as modern. No smoking signs in 1990s. Bars, daggers clubs, even walking sticks could turn into weapons if the argument got heated enough. And if you didn't have a weapon, no problem. Tankers were heavy, and so were wooden stools. Tavern brawls ranged from quick shoving matches to full-blown furniture, destroying chaos. Sometimes the tavern keeper stepped in. Sometimes they just watched from a distance, arms crossed, calculating how many tables they'd need to fix in the morning. Local authorities usually didn't care, unless someone died, or unless someone important got bruised. If it was just two peasants swinging wildly in the corner, while a lute player kept strumming in denial, it was basically a Friday night. But if a noble or a visiting merchant got involved, suddenly the law showed up and stocks were prepared. Or worse, you were fined a month's wages and banned from the tavern, which was basically medieval exile. Despite the risks, fighting was part of tavern culture. You went in for a drink and a laugh. Sometimes you got both. Sometimes you got a black eye and a story. You weren't allowed to tell around your grandmother medieval drinking wasn't just a man's game. In fact, if you walked into a tavern or bought ale from the corner stall, there was a good chance a woman had brewed it, sold it, and maybe poured it on your head. If you got mouthy, enter the alewife. One of the most common and underappreciated figures in medieval booze culture, alewives weren't just women who brewed beer. They were the primary brewers. For centuries, brewing was considered domestic work like baking or churning butter, except it could get you tipsy and occasionally cursed out by hungover blacksmiths. These women brewed small batches of ale at home, then sold it out of jugs, windows, or tiny stalls called tippling houses. Some operated out of their kitchens. Others ran full-on public alehouses, and yes, they could get in trouble, especially if their ale was too strong, too weak, or mysteriously made. People hallucinate and fight chickens. Wives were expected to follow local brewing laws, which changed depending on the town, the year, or the mood of the inspector. Prices were fixed by law, which meant if an alewife overcharged or watered down her product, she could be fined, publicly shamed, or forced to wear a paper hat, declaring "bad brewer, yes, really." Then there were tavern maids who worked inside the alehouses, pouring drinks, scrubbing tables, and trying not to get groped by guys named Oswald, with 3 teeth and too much meat in his system. These women had to be tough, fast, and fluent in insults. Some were just trying to earn a wage. Others flirted their way to better tips. A few married rich drunks and retired early, the medieval dream. But women weren't just behind the bar. They drank too, especially at festivals, weddings, or after dealing with 8 children and a cow that refused to cooperate. Drunkenness wasn't praised in women, but it wasn't unheard of either. And if the ale was good and the night was long, a few verses of body song were absolutely fair game in the Middle Ages. If you were sick, injured, or just looked mildly uncomfortable, someone was going to hand you alcohol. Maybe it was a priest, maybe it was your barber surgeon, maybe it was your grandmother. But rest assured, the medieval solution to almost anything was have a drink. And to be fair, it sometimes helped. Not because alcohol cured anything, but because when you're dizzy, feverish, or bleeding from a jousting mishap, a few cups of wine can take the edge off. Welcome to medieval medicine, where alcohol was painkiller antiseptic, sedative, and occasionally breakfast doctors. And again, that term's doing a lot of heavy lifting. Routinely prescribed wine and ale. If you had a cold, warm wine, a headache, wine with mint digestive issues, mead mixed with herbs served in what was essentially a hollowed-out medieval mug, and a prayer even monks brewed herbal lures for healing purposes. These were strong, sweet syrupy concoctions, flavored with wormwood sage or whatever, looked vaguely medicinal in the garden. Today, we'd call that digestive. Back then, they called it medicine, and just hoped you didn't die. One particularly bold remedy involved soaking herbs in brandy, then drinking it to cleanse the humors. Whether it cleansed anything other than your self-respect is debatable. But you did stop complaining. Either from numbness or unconsciousness, in battlefield medicine, alcohol had a real purpose. It cleaned wounds, or more accurately, it stung like hell, and distracted you from the guy soaring off your leg with something that used to be a farming tool. Sometimes they gave the patient a strong drink before the amputation, sometimes they were the patient and just passed around the bottle. But medieval people didn't just use alcohol for injuries. It was prescribed for melancholy, plague symptoms, childbirth, recovery, and spiritual despair. If you were breathing, there was probably a bottle involved. Did it work? Occasionally. Did it make things worse? Also, occasionally. But hey, in an age where bloodletting was considered science and leeches were practically co-workers, alcohol was at least pleasantly wrong if there's one thing governments have always been good at. It's noticing when people are having fun and figuring out how to tax it. And in medieval Europe, alcohol was no exception. Drinking wasn't just a pastime, it was an economic engine. Brewing, selling, and serving alcohol created jobs, generated revenue, and gave local authorities yet another excuse to write unnecessarily dramatic laws. Some towns even had alicaners, official taste testers, who checked whether the beer was good, legal, and appropriately frothy. Not a bad gig, assuming you didn't mind. Gout taverns needed licenses to operate, though what counted as a license varied wildly. In some places, it was a stamped document. In others, it was just a verbal agreement with the local bailiff and a sack of onions as collateral. But if you served ale without permission, you could be fined, shamed, or shut down. Faster than a poorly played lute solo, prices were also regulated. That's right, price caps on beer authorities, posted ale prices on wooden boards, and alewives or tavern keepers who charged too much were punished in theory in practice. If your ale was strong and your cousin worked at the mayor's office, things got flexible, and then came the taxes. A-taxes, wine taxes, malt taxes. In some places, there were even drinking vessel taxes. Imagine getting fined for using a cup that was too fancy. Welcome to medieval capitalism. Monasteries and nobles often had tax exemptions. Of course, because nothing says divinely inspired like not paying duties on your barrels of mead. Meanwhile, peasants were stuck paying levies on every batch they brewed for family gatherings, even if it tasted like watery sadness. There were no farewell banquets. These regulations didn't stop quiet from cottages by the sea. They just made them more creative. Paid in gold coins. Some taverns operated unofficially. You didn't fade into a peaceful life. Record. And others simply bribed the right people, often hoped no one checked the ledgers too closely. You were never safe. A booming,
even if you
slightly
walked
illegal
away from the job
ale-soaked
your
economy
past didn't.
built on loopholes,
You had too many secrets
gossip,
in your head,
and the unshakable
too many
human
names in your
desire to
memory,
have a pint
and
at
too
the end
much
of a
blood
long
on your
day.
hands.
In short, medieval
People
booze
didn't want you
wasn't
retired.
just social.
They wanted you
it was
forgotten.
business. And
Which
business
usually
was
meant
booming
buried.
by the end of the
And
medieval
even if no one
period.
came after
the way
you,
people drank.
that's a big
and what they
if you
drank
had to live
started
with a
to
constant
shift
fear
slowly,
that someone might
subtly,
that a
and
new
with far
assassin,
fewer
young
pigs
and
in
eager to
taverns,
prove himself,
one
had
major
just
change
received
came
the
with
contract
the rise of
for a
stronger
shadowy
alcohol
figure who
distillation.
used to be someone
that
dangerous.
magical process that
So you
turns
changed
wine
your
into
name
something
again.
that could clean wounds
You moved
and
to a
erase
village
memories
where no one asked
became more
questions.
refined.
You
in the late
faked a
Middle
limp,
Ages,
sold
this
herbs,
gave birth to
pretended
early
you once
versions
worked
of
as a
brandy,
guard.
aquavit,
But even
water
then,
of life,
you didn't sleep
and
well.
other dangerously
You avoided
potent drinks
crowds
that made
You
beer
always
look like
sat
toddler
facing
juice.
the door.
At the same
You
time,
kept your dagger
international
under the
trade
floorboard,
expanded
next to the
exotic
pouch of
spices,
coins you never
new
touched,
brewing techniques,
because it still
and
smelled
eventually
like
sugar
the
and
man
rum
you earned it
made their
from.
way into Europe,
And you
with
couldn't
every
trust yourself
shipload of
either.
imported goods. Years of
Drinking
silent
culture
killings and
evolved
quick
me,
escapes,
and
did
ale
something
began
to
to
your
lose
brain.
ground to wine
Every
and
knock
spirits,
on the door made you
especially
flinch.
among the wealthy.
Every stranger
now
on the
wanted to
road
sip
might recognize
imported
you,
claret,
and pretend they
stopped
were
dreaming,
part of the
because
Renaissance
dreaming
taverns.
was dangerous.
Also got an upgrade
couldn't
by the
love.
16th century.
You couldn't relax.
Some evolved into
You
inns
couldn't
and
laugh
public
too loud.
houses.
You
Early
lived like a
versions
ghost,
of the pub,
pretending to be a
drinking
man.
was no longer just
truth
something
was,
you did after
there was
work.
no end game for
It
a
became
medieval
a structured
assassin,
part of travel
just a
politics,
slow, cold
and
fade
even
into
postal
obscurity.
delivery.
Always
Yes,
moving,
medieval mailmen
always
drank
watching.
frequently,
Until
and
one
then
day
came
you
the
slipped into the
Reformation,
dark,
which poured
and
cold
no one
water and
noticed.
guilt
And
on a
maybe
lot of
that
the
was the
party.
best you could hope for.
Reformers like
By
Calvin
now,
and
you've
Knox
probably
were
figured
not
it
big
out.
fans of public
Being a
drunkenness.
medieval assassin
Suddenly
wasn't
drinking
darkly romantic.
became a moral
It
battleground.
wasn't noble.
And taverns
wasn't
were
even all
accused
that
of
profitable.
being dens of sin.
It was a grim,
sloth
thankless,
and
questionable
short-lived
career,
fiddle-playing governments
wrapped in
got stricter
blood-stained linen,
licensing
and
laws,
followed by a crowd of
multiplied
people who
taxes,
wanted you dead.
increased public
You wouldn't
drunkenness,
last
was
not a week,
increasingly criminalized.
maybe not even a day,
But the desire
because
for a good
you'd
drink
start
that
with the
never
wrong
went away,
assumptions.
it just adapted.
That you'd be sleek in
Allewatives
control,
were pushed out
a
by
whisper in the
guilds
dark.
and mal-run breweries.
But what you'd really
Wine
be
was
is
regulated
cold,
by state-appointed
hungry,
officials,
and one
spirits
bad guess
became
away from the
fashionable in
news.
court. And
You'd slip
slowly
into
but
town,
surely,
drinking
cloak pulled
moved
tight,
from an
ready
everyday
for action,
necessity
only
to
to
more of a
discover that
social
your
choice.
target
moved
The
location.
Middle Ages gave way
guards
to
are
modernity,
drunk, but trigger
and
happy.
while we gained better
And the stable
sanitation,
boy you paid for
cleaner
information,
water, and
just sold
slightly
you
less
out
for a
me,
mug of ale,
we also
and a
started
piece
to
of bread.
forget how
You'd
deeply
freeze at the
entwined
wrong
alcohol
time,
had been,
stab
with
the wrong
survival
guy,
celebration,
get
and
spotted
social
by
life for
someone's
centuries.
maid, who once
In
saw
ancient
your
Babylon,
face near the
love was
chapel.
not a
And
spontaneous,
suddenly,
rosy
you're
cheeked
not
affair.
a shadow.
It
You're
was
the
war,
problem.
and like any
Then
good
what
war,
you run,
it required
but you're not
strategy,
used to medieval
incantations,
terrains. And
the mud,
sometimes the assistance of a
uneven
very grumpy
cobblestones,
demon
the
Babylonian,
absolutely
love magic,
insane
didn't
number
shy
of
away
loose
from
chickens in the
meddling
street.
with the
You
supernatural.
slip, fall,
If
get
you couldn't
tackled
win
by a
someone's
guard named
affection
Thomas,
through charm,
who just got
you'd
dumped
write
and
their
is
name
looking
on
for
a
an
cursed
outlet.
clay figurine,
And let's say you
and bury
survived
it near
that.
their door.
Then you deal
just
with
like
the
that.
aftermath.
You had
No
leverage.
allies,
Who needs
no
roses,
honors,
when
and
you've
no
got
future.
necromancy?
Just whispers,
The Babylonians
suspicion,
believed
and the
love
growing
could be summoned,
realization that
or subdued
even if
through
you succeed,
ritual
the
and
best you can
invocation
hope for
tablets
is
from
to die
Mesopotamian
old and
archives
alone,
describe
hiding behind a
enchantments,
false name
where
in
a
a village
priest or
that still
sorceress
believes in
would
fairies.
call upon Ishtar,
So,
the goddess
no,
of love
you
and
wouldn't
war,
last
to bend
and
the
frankly,
will of a target.
you shouldn't try.
And Ishtar
because
was not
the
the gentle
assassin's life
harp-playing
wasn't
type.
cool.
She once
It was a
destroyed
cruel
an entire
machine
mountain
that chewed
range
people up
because
and
someone
spat
doubted
out
her.
nothing but shadows.
So yes,
She
it
knew
offered
a thing
power
or two about
without
vengeance
peace
and
passion.
purpose.
Some spells
Without a
included
place
hair
in the
nail
world.
clippings or drops
You didn't
of blood.
make history.
Organic
You
tokens
erased
to
yourself
tether the
from
lover's
it.
soul to the spellcaster.
And the only thing waiting for you at the
These
end
were either
was
burned in
silence.
small fires,
A
dissolved
silence
into
no
oils,
one would question,
or wrapped inside
because no one
fabric
even
pouches.
remembered you were
These
there
pouches
in the
would
first
be buried
place.
beneath thresholds.
Before she
or
was the
hidden in
feared
beds
queen of
to heat
Macedonia,
the heart of the
Olympus
desired
was
person.
known as Myrtale.
That heating
a
could
Maloyan
sometimes
princess
cause obsession
from the rugged
madness.
tribal lands of
But hey,
Epirus.
What's
Her
love
people claimed
without a
descent
little
from
side
Achilles
effect?
himself,
And it wasn't
and whether
all
or
about
not the
attraction.
blood of heroes truly
Babylonian
ran in her
texts
veins
also mention
one
a
thing was
patriarchic
certain.
spells.
This was
designed
not
to
a
drive
woman
away
born for
unwanted
the sidelines of
suitors
history.
or remove a rival's erotic
From a young
pull
age,
in one
Myrtle was
particularly
steeped in
mystery
nasty
and
charm.
ritual.
A
Her
woman
upbringing
asked
was
the
shaped
gods
not
to
just
make
by
her
rival's
politics,
breath
but by
smell like a
prophecy,
corpse,
ecstatic
subtle,
rites,
effective, and
a
guaranteed
reverence
to ruin
for the
any
ancient
moonlit
gods.
moment. She
This
wasn't the
mix
type
of
of erotic
princess who
desire
smiled
and
and
divine
embroidered
manipulation created
No,
a culture
she was
where
drawn
love
to
was a
serpents,
battlefield,
omens,
layered
and the
in
frenzied
ash,
ceremonies
honey,
of the
blood,
cult
and
of
whispers,
Dionysus,
where
you
women
didn't just
danced
hope someone
barefoot
loved
in the
you.
moonlight. You
You
dragged
called
them
upon
into
the
a
divine
cosmic
in
tug of
states of
war
trance.
using scrolls.
Her connection to the
dolls, and
gods
invisible
wasn't
spirits
performative.
to tip the scale.
It was
love.
personal.
In Babylon
didn't
was
merely
rarely
worship.
mutual.
She
It was an act
embodied.
of will. And
According
when
to
words
ancient
failed,
sources,
spells
likely
stepped
written
in,
by men,
etched
both
in
terrified
uniform,
and
whispered
enthralled.
to the stars, and
She
sealed
kept
with
sacred
sacred snakes
smoke.
in her chambers.
Babylonian love
and even
wasn't
allowed
pure,
them to coil
but
beside
it was
her in
potent
bed.
in ancient
Whether
Greece.
this was a literal fact,
Love spells were
or
less
the kind
about
of heart
hearts
slander
and
that
flowers,
powerful women
and more
attract
about
like
domination
flies,
and
we'll never
desperation.
know. But
The
it
Greeks
stuck
had
to
a
her
specific
allies.
name for this
It made her
magical
divine.
obsession.
To
Eros.
her enemies.
But it wasn't the
It made
gentle
her
affection
dangerous.
you'd write poetry
Her real
about.
power began
It was a
not
frenzied,
in a battlefield
all-consuming
or throne room,
madness,
but
more
in the
likely to
uneasy
land
flicker of
someone in a
torchlight,
temple begging
among
for
the
mercy,
whispers of
than
priestesses
walking hand in hand
and the
through
curling
olive
bodies
groves.
of serpents.
Greek love magic was split into two powerful branches, agoge spells and philia spells. Agoge spells were meant to drag someone, sometimes literally, to the practitioner usually used by men. These spells aimed to inflame lust, cause sleeplessness, and even make the victim hallucinate until they surrendered to desire. A typical Aog spell might say something like, "Burn her heart until she comes to me crawling." Yes, crawling Greeks were not subtle about their intentions. The spells were often written on lead tablets, cheap, durable, and heavy with symbolism, and buried in graveyards or wells places, considered gateways to the underworld. Why? Because these spells often invoked underworld spirits or restless ghosts to do the dirty work. You wanted someone to fall in love. You'd call on a dead guy who had nothing better to do. On the other hand, philia spells were more affection management. These were often used by women trying to maintain peace in marriages or control their husband's wandering eyes, rather than summon burning passion. Philia spells focused on harmony and loyalty. They were sometimes infused into wine or oil, acting like magical tranquilizers hidden in daily rituals. Of course, herbs and potions played their part. Greeks used aphrodisiacs like mandrake root, which looked vaguely human and was believed to scream when uprooted. Probably not ideal first-date material. Love potions also included honey myrrh and even crushed bones mixed into drinks or rubbed onto clothes. A particularly strong recipe involved menstrual, blood, an intimate and powerful ingredient believed to tie a man's soul to his lovers forever. Greek erotic magic wasn't romantic. In the modern sense, it was strategic, visceral, and usually aimed at control rather than consent. Os, the god of love, was often depicted blindfolded and armed with arrows for a reason. Love wasn't just blind, it was dangerous, and the Greeks knew exactly how to weaponize it when it came to love. The ancient Romans took what the Greeks started and added more wine, more drama, and far more legal loopholes. Roman love spells weren't merely folk traditions whispered by lonely hearts. They were considered tools of influence, status, preservation, and occasionally straight-up revenge in a society obsessed with order and honor. Controlling another person's desires became a stealthy way of rewriting fate itself. Roman love magic came in many forms, but defiction binding spells were among the most popular. These were usually etched into thin sheets of lead and folded like cursed love letters before being buried in tombs or tossed into rivers. The idea entrapped the target's mind, body, and spirit by invoking chthonic deities like Pluto or Hecate. The writing was often sharp, commanding, and full of desperate pleas. Some read like court summons. Others resembled melodramatic fan fiction. A particularly eerie example from Rome asks that a woman named Victrix burn with love for me. Marcus like a torch, day and night, until she can no longer bear to be without me. Sounds romantic until you realize Marcus buried that spell next to a child's grave to add extra power. Roman ethics, optional perfumes and oils were another avenue for magical manipulation.
Women would anoint themselves or their intended lovers with concoctions laced with herbs like vervain mint, or even belladonna, which could sedate or stimulate depending on the dosage. A sweet-smelling woman might not just be trying to impress. She could have been dosing her towering crush with a micro-love spell in liquid form. One particularly scandalous Roman tactic was the so-called Venus wine, a potent love potion allegedly containing animal parts, exotic herbs, and bodily fluids. Slaves and courtesans were rumored to slip it into their masters' goblets to tilt the power balance if the potion didn't work. At least the hangover might spark some vulnerability. Roman law, interestingly, did acknowledge love magic, but not as a crime of passion. Instead, it was lumped into sorcery and considered a public threat if it disrupted property rights or inheritance. Love was all fun and games until someone cursed a senator into celibacy. For the Romans, love was political magical and occasionally toxic, just the way they liked it in ancient Egypt. Love was sacred, mystical, and dangerous in the hands of the wrong priest. Egyptian love spells combined religious devotion, poetic metaphor, and when needed, ruthless manipulation. These weren't the ramblings of a heartbroken teen. They were carefully composed rites often recorded on papyrus and backed by the authority of deities like Hathor, Isis, and Bez. If your heart was broken in Egypt, you didn't cry. You conjured. Egyptians believed love could be stirred like a potion or unlocked like a tomb, and their magic reflected this. A common technique was the dream spell, in which the spellcaster summoned a god or demon to appear in the dream of the desired person. The spell would whisper, "You long for her, like the desert longs for rain." Elegant, yes, manipulative, absolutely. One recovered papyrus from the Ptolemaic period describes a spell where the target's heart is likened to a captive bird, fluttering endlessly unless reunited with the one who casts the charm. These texts were often written in red ink, considered magically potent, and sometimes included miniature drawings of bound figures or symbolic birds with clipped wings, a visual cue just in case the gods needed reminding. But it wasn't all about metaphor. Physical objects had power too. Wax figurines were used to represent both the spellcaster and the target. These dolls were anointed with perfumes, pierced with needles, or placed in jars with inscribed love formulas, and depending on the goal, passion, or punishment, the results varied wildly. Want affection? Rub the doll with lotus oil. Want revenge for rejection? Add scorpion venom. Potions were popular, often involving ingredients like honey wine, mandrake root, and unsurprisingly blood. Some spells even required menstrual blood mixed with beer, which was believed to bind the man's soul to the woman through shared essence. Offer that at a modern cocktail bar and see how it goes. What truly set Egyptian love magic apart was its divine undertone. These weren't mere tricks. They were invocations. Love and lust were seen as natural extensions of divine will, but divine will could be influenced with the right hymn, the right words, and a properly charged amulet ingredients that walked the line between medicine magic and outright poison. You weren't just wooing someone with roses, you were slipping them a cocktail of hallucinogens, animal parts, and sometimes your own bodily fluids. If modern dating is complicated, at least it doesn't usually involve powdered mummy in ancient love magic. Ingredients weren't chosen for their smell or taste. They were selected for symbolic and spiritual force. The more potent or taboo the object, the more power it was believed to have. Hair, fingernails, spit, and menstrual blood were commonly used because they contained personal essence to bind someone you needed, part of them or part of yourself. But some recipes went well beyond the personal. In Babylon, spells sometimes called for scraps of lion skin, crocodile fat, or the feathers of nocturnal birds, creatures thought to live between worlds in Egypt. Scorpion venom might be smeared onto amulets or mixed with myrrh to stir both desire and dread. In Rome, spells occasionally included the ashes of burned bones, or disturbingly, the remains of condemned criminals. If love couldn't be earned, it would be stolen from the world of the dead. One particularly twisted Greek recipe instructed the user to obtain the bones of a bat, grind them with honey and wine, and leave the mixture beneath a moonlit statue of Aphrodite. Drink it, and your target would become mad with desire. Of course, they might also become mad full stop. Many potions blurred the line between aphrodisiac and poison belladonna. Mandrae and henbane were all popular ingredients taken in the right amount. They induced light-headedness and emotional openness taken in the wrong amount. Well, let's just say love became eternal in a tombstone kind of way. And while men often wielded love spells to incite lust, women frequently used more subtle means, clothing enchantments, food magic, or charm bags sewn with silken herbs. These might be hidden in pillows or hung beneath beds. One Babylonian spell even instructs a woman to anoint her breasts with a sacred oil before embracing her lover, making the moment both erotic and enchanted. Not all ancient love spells were meant to ignite passion. Some were curses in disguise, wrapped in seductive words but loaded with venom. These weren't about mutual desire. They were about domination, humiliation, or vengeance. And their true goal wasn't love. It was control in ancient Greece and Rome. Many so-called love spells were actually defiction. Binding curses meant to overwhelm the will of the victim. They might be phrased sweetly, "May she think of no other man but me." But their methods were sinister. The idea was to shatter a person's emotional independence, rendering them sleepless, obsessed, and emotionally enslaved. If that sounds like psychological warfare, it was these spells often targeted the mind and body. A popular Greek curse would ask deities of the underworld to bind the targets, arms, legs, tongue, and even genitals, rendering them helpless unless they came crawling back to the spellcaster. Lead tablets inscribed with these curses were folded tightly, symbolizing the sealed fate of the victim, and deposited in graves' wells or crossroads, all liminal places where divine and human realms met. One infamous Roman example begged Pluto to turn her thoughts into madness until she seeks me out in the streets. It included specific bodily instructions. Bind her knees so she cannot dance with another, bind her lips so she cannot kiss another. It wasn't romance. It was emotional kidnapping, complete with ghostly accomplices. Sometimes these love curses included a second victim, a rival in that case. The spell would redirect all of the target's passion to the caster, while simultaneously ruining the rivals. Chances one spell from Carthage curses a woman's competitor with hair loss, a rotting voice, and womb sickness, a terrifying way to ensure she wouldn't be anyone's object of affection. Even in Egypt, where love magic often took poetic forms, curses seeped in. Some spells invoked lion-headed deities to tear apart a target's peace of mind until they submitted. Others used figurines of the victim, stabbed, burned, or broken, while reciting verses to bind their heart to the practitioner. Despite the elaborate rituals and eerie curses, ancient love magic wasn't always hidden in temples or carved into cryptic tablets. Much of it lived in the ordinary, woven into the routines of daily life. For many, casting a love spell was as natural as brushing one's hair or pouring wine. Magic wasn't separate from reality. It was embedded in it. In bustling markets, from Babylon to Athens, vendors didn't just sell figs and perfumes, they also sold magical charms. Small amulets made from carnelian hematite or bronze were carried in tunics or sewn into garments to attract affection or shield against unwanted advances. Some were shaped like phalluses, others like tiny hands or eyes, symbols believed to either charm or ward off lust. A girl might wear one when hoping to catch the attention of a suitor. A wife might tuck one under her mattress to keep her husband loyal. Love magic also slipped into food. Meals were prepared with more than just spice. There was intent in Rome. Women were known to stir aphrodisiacs into sauces, pour honeyed wine laced with herbs, or serve bread kneaded with whispered spells. One Egyptian charm directed the user to breathe into the cooking pot and speak the beloved's name. 3 times dinner became a slow seduction, each bite a step closer to enchantment. Even cosmetics weren't immune. Ancient Greek women ground special herbs into their eye or lip pigments, believing it would make their gaze irresistible. A spell from the Hellenistic period instructed a woman to recite lines from a hymn to Aphrodite while applying rouge, transforming her daily beautifying routine into a sacred act of attraction. Clothing, too, carried magic. A Babylonian text recommends washing a garment in enchanted water before offering it to a potential lover. In doing so, the shirt itself became a charm, and if that lover wore it, the spell was said to tighten like a net. These everyday spells weren't always grand or theatrical. They were subtle, intimate, performed in kitchens, bedrooms, and bathhouse. To the ancients, love magic wasn't reserved for desperate sorcerers or vengeful aristocrats. It was for everyone, for all their seductive promises. Ancient love spells were never guaranteed to work, and when they did, the consequences could be disturbing, even tragic. While many spellcasters imagined a blissful union as the result of their magical efforts, ancient texts and warnings suggest that love magic often unraveled in unexpected and terrifying ways. The same spell meant to bind a lover could just as easily summon illness, madness, or divine punishment in Greece and Rome. Philosophers and priests alike cautioned against meddling with the will of others. Theophrastus mocked those who relied on love potions, portraying them as foolish and desperate plenty. The elder flat-out labeled love magic as dangerous superstition, warning that its practitioners were either deluded or criminal. Even in magical papyri, cautionary lines were often included. Do not call upon this spirit unless you are ready to accept what follows, and what followed could be grotesque. One Roman legend tells of a man driven mad by a failed spell. He wandered the streets at night, calling out the name of a woman he no longer recognized. In another tale, a woman who used a potion to secure her husband's fidelity found herself the target of his obsession as he became violent and paranoid, convinced she was unfaithful. Despite her original intentions, some spells even warned that the gods might turn on the user. In Egypt, invoking Hathor or Isis without proper offerings could anger the deity, bringing misfortune instead of romance. One recovered scroll states, "If she is not meant to love you, your heart shall know sorrow tenfold." That's ancient for don't try to force it. Rivals could also fight back. A targeted woman might hire a counter-magician to unbind her from the original spell or to curse the practitioner in return. These magical feuds could escalate into full-blown hex wars, with spells flying in both directions, sometimes over years. Protective charms, salt circles, and sacred words were all part of the defense. Perhaps most chillingly, love spells often succeeded in creating obsession rather than affection. The victim might feel compelled but confused. Physically drawn but emotionally vacant love turned into compulsion, a haunting echo of true connection. Though the gods of Babylon have long fallen silent, and Roman grave tablets have crumbled, the heartbeat of ancient love magic never truly stopped. It simply adapted the spells, potions, and rituals of the ancient world, evolved, repackaged into folk traditions, whispered superstitions, and even self-help rituals. We still see today take the concept of the love potion, while modern science scoffs at the idea of aphrodisiac elixir. The shelves of health stores still overflow with tonics, promising enhanced attraction, deeper intimacy, or natural magnetism. Ancient herbs like Mandre Damiana and ginseng still find their way into teas and oils meant to rekindle passion. We may not invoke Venus or Ishtar anymore, but the desire to bottle love remains strong in parts of southern Italy. Folk traditions continue to echo Roman and Greek magical beliefs. Red ribbons tied under mattresses, herbal sachets hidden in clothing, and whispered charms passed down through grandmothers mirror the rituals once practiced in classical temples and street corners alike. In parts of the Middle East and North Africa, fragments of Egyptian and Mesopotamian love magic survive in talismans worn discreetly, or spells spoken during cooking, even in pop culture. Ancient love magic lives on films, books, and songs often portray the enchanted lover. Whether it's a vampire compelled by a blood bond or a potion slipping into a wine glass. At just the right moment, the trope of the love spell gone wrong remains a favorite storyline, reflecting ancient warnings that passion conjured by force may unravel into chaos. More curiously, modern psychology has uncovered parallels between old spells and techniques used to increase attraction, mirroring body language using scent to trigger emotional memory or timing. Confessions to maximize emotional impact were those ancient spellcasters simply using proto-psychological hacks cloaked in divine language and ritual drama. Today, love spells are still sold online, though now dressed in pastel branding and witchy aesthetics. Etsy shops offer customized candle spells, while TikTok hosts manifestation tutorials that wouldn't seem out of place on a Greek papyrus scroll in the end. Ancient love magic wasn't just about getting someone to love you. It was about regaining control in the face of longing. That impulse, timeless, desperate, beautifully human, remains with us. We still chase that same alchemy, to be seen, desired, chosen. And if a little magic helps along the way, so be it. In ancient Greece, sport was not a pastime. It was a sacred duty, a divine performance of flesh and will before. The gods nowhere was this more evident than at the Olympic Games first held in 776 BCE in Olympia, a sanctuary site dedicated to Zeus for over 1,000 years. Greeks from city-states across the Hellenic world gathered every 4 years not for politics or war, but to chase immortality through muscle and grit. The games weren't casual contests. Athletes trained for months, sometimes years, under the watchful eyes of coaches, priests, and even philosophers. Before competing, they swore an oath to Zeus, promising they had prepared honestly and would not cheat. This wasn't just formality. Breaking the oath could result in public flogging or disgraceful disqualification. Honor was everything. And if you're imagining chariot races and discus throws with dignified robes flapping in the wind, top Greek athletes competed completely, nude. It was a celebration of the male form. Yes, but also a sign of transparency. Nothing hidden, no armor, no trickery, just raw athleticism, and the judgment of the gods above the original events were simple foot races, long jump discus, javelin wrestling, and boxing. Then came the pancration, a brutal combination of wrestling and boxing with barely any rules. Fingers were broken, eyes were gouged. The crowd cheered. Death wasn't common, but it wasn't forbidden. Either winning brought more than bragging rights. Victors were crowned with a simple olive wreath, but they returned home as heroes. Some cities awarded winners with free meals for life, prime seats at the theater, or even exemption from taxes. Poets would immortalize their names. Sculptors might carve their likeness into marble for a fleeting moment. They were godlike, but there was no room for women not in the audience, and certainly not as competitors. The Olympic Games were for men. Only though women did have their own separate festival, the Heria also held at Olympia, featuring foot races for unmarried girls. Still, it palled in comparison to the testosterone-fueled spectacle that defined the male arena. The Greek Olympics were more than games. They were a sacred fire, burning with ambition, discipline, and divine expectation to run, to wrestle, to win. It wasn't just athleticism, it was ritual. It was legacy. It was war without weapons. If the Greeks turned sports into sacred ritual, the Romans turned them into a blood-soaked spectacle in the Roman Empire. Athletics meant violence, and no event embodied this more than the gladiatorial games. These weren't polite matches. In tunics, they were brutal performances of life and death designed to thrill the masses, honor the dead, and remind everyone who held the power. Gladiators were typically slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. But despite their low status, they became household names. Some, like Spartacus, rose to legendary fame, admired even as they were paraded into combat, for the crowd's delight, trained in special schools called ludi. These men, and occasionally women, were taught to fight with discipline, precision, and flair. The more theatrical, the better bleeding was part of the entertainment. The most famous arena was, of course, the Colosseum in Rome, an engineering marvel that could hold up to 50,000 spectators. Events were free, paid for by emperors and politicians eager to win public favor, bread and circuses. They called it keep the people fed and entertained, and they won't ask too many questions about corruption or conquest. Combat styles varied. Some gladiators fought with swords and shields, Surus others with nets and trident retiari. Each type had its own strengths, weaknesses, and costume carefully curated to keep matchups unpredictable and exciting. The games also included moxie battles, wild animal hunts, and public executions. It was athleticism meets theater, meets horror, but not every fight ended in death. Contrary to popular belief, most matches ended when one fighter conceded killing. A well-trained gladiator was bad for business. These fighters were investments. Only the editor, the person sponsoring the games, could decide if a loser lived or died. And yes, the infamous thumbs up or down gesture, probably a myth. Ancient sources are ambiguous, so let's chalk that up to Hollywood flair. Despite their blood-stained purpose, some gladiators achieved celebrity status. They received gifts, fan letters. Yes, ancient graffiti has been found praising their beautiful thighs, and sometimes even freedom-retired gladiators could become trainers, bodyguards, or minor celebrities long before football, baseball, or basketball. The peoples of Mesoamerica played a game that was part sport, part religious drama, and part cosmic allegory, known today as the Mesoamerican ball game, or by its Noetal name, or Lamalisti. This was no weekend leisure activity. It was a sacred rite, a political tool, and occasionally a death sentence played by the Olmeymer and Aztecs. The game involved a heavy rubber ball, sometimes weighing as much as 4 kilograms, that players had to keep in motion, using only their hips, elbows, knees, or thighs. No hands allowed. The goal varied by region and era, but in many cases, it involved hitting the ball through a vertical stone ring mounted high on the court wall. Considering the size of the ball and the limited body parts allowed, scoring a point was nothing short of miraculous. The courts known as or arenas were shaped like a capital tourniquet with sloping sides and often surrounded by carvings depicting gods, warriors, and scenes of sacrifice. These weren't your average playgrounds. They were stages where the divine and human collided. And it wasn't just about winning or losing. The ball game was deeply symbolic. It represented the eternal battle between life and death, day and night, the gods and the underworld. In some versions of the myth, the game was reenacting the journey of the hero twins from the Mayapop Vu, who descended into the underworld and played against death itself, the most controversial element: ritual sacrifice. Contrary to popular myth, Not all games ended in death, but many important matches, especially those tied to religious festivals, did the sacrificed weren't always the losers either. In some elite contexts, the captain of the winning team was offered as a noble tribute to the gods, ascending in theory to divine favor through death. Others argue it was the losers who paid the price, a public display of cosmic justice. What's undeniable is the cultural weight of the game. It wasn't mere entertainment, it was theology in motion. The thud of the rubber ball echoed through temple plazas, a heartbeat of belief, identity, and power. When it came to physical activity, the ancient Egyptians blended leisure, ritual, and preparation for the afterlife. Sports weren't simply a diversion. They were reflections of cosmic balance, royal power, and divine order. While they lacked massive public arenas like the Greeks or Romans, Egyptian society still nurtured athleticism with a spiritual undercurrent that made every movement meaningful. Wrestling was perhaps the most visually documented of all ancient Egyptian sports. Tomb paintings, dating back over 4,000 years, show pairs of young men locked in grapples, executing complex throws and holds that wouldn't look out of place in modern judo. These weren't staged performances. They were serious training exercises that emphasized discipline, coordination, and balance. Wrestling was often used to train soldiers and elite guards, but it also had ritual significance, symbolizing the eternal struggle between order, Mahat, and chaos. Archery was another vital sport, especially for the pharaohs. Depictions of rulers firing arrows from chariots, sometimes while the vehicle was in motion, were not just records of skill, but political propaganda. A strong pharaoh was a divinely approved one, and mastery of the bow was proof of divine favor and martial readiness. During festivals, kings would sometimes demonstrate their prowess by shooting arrows through copper rings surrounded by cheering priests, and nobles. Rowing competitions also held a place in ancient Egyptian life, especially along the Nile. Crews of young men competed in ceremonial regattas, their synchronized strokes reflecting discipline and unity. These weren't just for sport. They honored the gods and recreated mythical journeys like the solar bark of Ra. Crossing the heavens for the everyday Egyptian sports included tugafuar, leapfrog, like jumping games, and rhythmic dancing activities. Both joyful and communal children practiced balancing and acrobatics, while laborers stayed physically fit through their daily work. Athletic games during festivals often served as community bonding and religious observance, blending sweat with spirituality. Interestingly, Egyptian women participated more than in many ancient cultures. Wall paintings show female dancers and gymnasts performing at banquets and ceremonies, often in celebration of fertility and divine femininity. While not competitive in the modern sense, these performances were athletic, graceful, and held symbolic weight in ancient China. Sports weren't just about physical prowess. They were tightly woven into the fabric of Confucian values, military training, imperial politics, and the pursuit of harmony between mind and body. From battlefield simulations to courtly pastimes, athletic activities served both the elite and commoners, often reflecting deeper philosophical ideals. Archery held a particularly exalted place in Confucian tradition. The nobleman was expected to master the bow not only as a warrior, but as a gentleman. Competitions were formalized and deeply ritualistic during the Zhou dynasty. Archery contests were held in ceremonial halls, where etiquette mattered as much as accuracy. Participants bowed, recited prescribed phrases, and shot not to kill, but to demonstrate inner virtue and discipline. Hitting the target was seen as a metaphor for hitting moral perfection. But not all sports, in ancient China, were so serene. Enter Jigu, Chinese polo, introduced during the Han Dynasty, and reaching peak popularity under the Tang polo, became the sport of emperors, generals, and aristocrats, played on horseback with long mallets. It was thrilling, fast-paced, and surprisingly dangerous. Emperor Xiong of Tang even died in a polo accident. Still, the sport was embraced by both men and women of the court. Noble women in silk robes could be seen galloping alongside their male counterparts, striking balls with astonishing agility. In an age of rigid gender roles, polo briefly leveled the playing field. Military sports also flourished. Coup, an early form of soccer, was originally developed to keep soldiers agile, and coordinated players kicked a leather ball through a net or hole in a wall using precise footwork. Over time, Cuju became a popular civilian game as well, eventually gaining recognition as the earliest documented form of football. Martial arts, too, found expression through sport wu. And early forms of kung fu weren't just combat techniques. They were disciplines that cultivated the spirit as much as the body. Sparring matches and strength tests were common in military mise, and public demonstrations often staged during festivals. Even games like chess and go weiki were viewed as mental sports testing, strategy, foresight, and emotional control. The ideal sportsman wasn't merely strong. He was balanced, restrained, and morally upright. In the ancient Near East spanning Mesopotamia, Assyria, Persia, and beyond, sports were rarely just games. Athleticism was often a reflection of power, divine favor, and military preparedness. Physical feats weren't celebrated in isolation. They were part of public ritual, royal image building, and the cultural machinery of empire in Mesopotamia. The earliest known urban civilizations developed a range of physical activities, though they didn't formalize sport. Quite like the Greeks, wrestling, for example, features prominently in Sumerian art and literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the hero wrestling the wild man in Kedu in a contest so fierce that it shakes the very foundations of the city, only for the two to end up as lifelong companions. Wrestling wasn't just for sport, it symbolized raw strength, dominance, and respect. Among equals, kings were expected to be physically formidable. Assyrian and Babylonian rulers often commissioned reliefs, showing themselves hunting lions or engaging in military drills. These weren't staged for mere vanity. They were political statements. Killing a lion by hand wasn't just a show of courage. It declared that the king could tame chaos and uphold order. That lion hunt, it was state-sponsored propaganda. In muscular form, the Persians, under the Achaemenid Empire, developed one of the earliest formalized military training programs that blended athletics with ethics. Young boys were taught to ride a horse, draw a bow, and speak the truth. A triad that fused sport warfare and moral education. Archery and horse riding were both vital not just for battle readiness, but as symbols of elite status. Public displays of strength also played a role in temple rituals. Festivals often included competitions like foot races, stone lifting, or even ceremonial fights. Depending on the region and deity being honored, these events were watched by priests, officials, and sometimes even kings, reinforcing the idea that the body, like the city or the cosmos, needed to be strong and disciplined. One unique contribution from the Near East was the use of board games like the royal game, of which, while not physically demanding, were seen as mental duels, sometimes even tools for divination, just like with archery or wrestling. Success reflected divine favor in the ancient civilizations of South Asia, particularly the Indus Valley and early Vedic societies. Physical culture was deeply interwoven with social hierarchy, spiritual training, and the pursuit of balance between body and mind. Though archaeological evidence from the Indus Valley is sparse in terms of organized sport, clues from urban planning figurines and later Vedic texts reveal a society that valued physical agility, strength, and discipline. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro featured large public baths and open courtyards that may have been used for communal gatherings, water rituals, or athletic exercises, terracotta figurines show people in dynamic poses, wrestlers, dancers, and acrobats, suggesting that movement and performance were essential parts of daily life. Though no Olympic-style events are documented, the environment hints at a culture where the body was trained not just for survival, but for aesthetic and ritual purposes. As society transitioned into the Vedic period, the emphasis on physical prowess became more codified, particularly through Danova, the ancient science of warfare. Young warriors were trained in archery, swordsmanship, chariot driving, and hand-to-hand combat competitions, often accompanied royal festivals where princes showcased their martial skill to assert dominance and attract political alliances. Wrestling Maluda emerged as one of the most revered sports in ancient India. More than just brute force, it was a spiritual practice. Wrestlers followed strict dietary and moral codes, lived disciplined lives, and often trained in temples. The Ara, a traditional wrestling school, functioned like a monastery, emphasizing mental purity as much as physical strength. The practice survives today in modified forms, still deeply respected ball games, and dice games also appear in Sanskrit. Texts, Krita, the Sanskrit word for sport, encompassed everything from racing animals to playing strategy games in the Mahabharata. Even divine heroes like Krishna and Arjuna are shown participating in sports, often using their skills as metaphors for cosmic struggle yoga. Two originated during this period, not as a gentle stretching routine, but as a rigorous system of physical and mental discipline aimed at achieving spiritual liberation. Athleticism here was not for glory, but transcendence. Though often overlooked in historical accounts, women in the ancient world did participate in sports, though usually under strict limitations and in gender-specific arenas when women trained, competed, or performed physical feats. It was often tied to fertility grace or ritual purity rather than public spectacle or competition. Yet across cultures, we find surprising evidence of female athleticism, sometimes celebrated, sometimes suppressed, but never absent. In ancient Greece, women were banned from the Olympic Games, not just from competing, but even from watching. However, they had their own festival, the Haria, held in Olympia in honor of the goddess Hera. Young unmarried girls raced barefoot in tunics, shorter than the norm, their hair loose in contrast to married women's veils. Though there was no javelin or pancration, victory was still rewarded with olive crowns and commemorated with statues in Sparta. Women enjoyed far more athletic freedom. Spartan girls trained publicly in running, wrestling, and throwing, often competing in front of male audiences. Their athleticism was seen as a civic virtue. Strong mothers produced strong warriors, while the rest of Greece found this shocking. Sparta viewed female strength as foundational to their militarized society in Egypt. Tomb paintings and reliefs show women dancing, leaping, and performing gymnastic feats, particularly in festivals and religious ceremonies. These performances, though not competitive, were demanding and athletic. Some scenes even show paired female acrobats in mid-air poses, suggesting a long tradition of trained movement and physical artistry. Ancient Rome offers more complex examples, while elite Roman women rarely engaged in public sport. Lower-ass women and slaves occasionally performed in arenas as gladiatrices. Female gladiators, though rare inscriptions confirm their existence more commonly. Women participated in ball games, swimming, and equestrian training within private villas. In China Tang Dynasty, records show noble women playing polo, one of the only major sports that allowed women and men to compete side by side, dressed in flowing robes. They galloped through imperial courts, striking balls with precision. These scenes shocked later Confucian historians, but they demonstrate a brief window where elite women wielded athletic agency, though the crowds have vanished, and the dust of ancient stadiums has long settled. the spirit of ancient sports still pulses through the modern world, from Olympic gold medals to football stadium chants. Today's athletic culture owes more than just inspiration to the ancient world. It inherits its structure, its spectacle, and even its soul. The Olympic Games themselves are a direct resurrection. Revived in 1896, the modern Olympics were consciously modeled on their Greek ancestors, complete with ceremonial oaths, laurel motifs, and even the flame, a symbol once sacred to Hestia. The values may have shifted from divine favor to international cooperation, but the essential goal remains to celebrate the physical limits of the human body. Roman influence echoes in our love for stadium sports, massive arenas, structured leagues, and the theatricality of modern games, from entrance music to over-the-top commentary mirror. The gladiatorial shows of the Colosseum, even the idea of cheering sections uniforms and sports as national identity can be traced back to the imperial pageantry of Rome. Mesoamerican traditions resonate in the ways we tie sports to ritual and symbolism, though no modern game ends in human sacrifice. Thankfully, we still speak of athletes as warriors, matches as battles, and trophies as sacred objects. Victory remains mythologized, from China's elegant archery contests to the militaristic discipline of Persian training. The idea of sport as moral education has endured. Modern martial arts continue to teach not just movement, but respect, restraint, and self-mastery values rooted in ancient codes. Even forgotten games like Cuju and Creta have seen renewed interest as historians and enthusiasts seek to rediscover the diverse origins of modern athletics. Ancient board games, too, are reappearing in popular culture, not as dusty relics, but as reminders that competition isn't always physical. Perhaps most striking is how the ancient world framed sports as more than recreation. They were political tools, religious expressions, and acts of identity. Today, when athletes kneel, speak out, or represent entire nations, we're seeing the same tradition unfold: sport as narrative, as power, as legacy. In short, the ancient world didn't just invent games, it invented the idea that through sport, humanity could aspire to greatness. Not just strength or speed, but honor, meaning, and the eternal pursuit of something just beyond our reach. Paris, the city of light, romance, revolution, and art. But few tourists realize that beneath the elegant boulevards and iconic monuments lies another city far darker and infinitely more silent. A shadow Paris stitched together by tunnels carved into limestone and lined wall to wall with bones. This is the catacombs, a 200-mile underworld filled with the remains of over 6 million people. The descent into the catacombs begins innocently enough. A spiral staircase leads you down, away from the noise of the living world. The air grows colder, the light dims, and then you're there in the Oari, a space where walls are literally made of human bones, stacked with disturbing precision. Skulls are arranged in rows like trophies. Femurs cross-hatched in decorative patterns. Some tunnels even form shapes. Hearts, crosses, columns. It's morbidly artistic and disturbingly calm. This macabre labyrinth was never built with tourists in mind. In fact, the catacombs began as limestone quarries dug as early as the Roman era. Paris grew by using the very bones of its earth limestone for buildings, cathedrals, bridges. But by the 1700s, those empty quarry tunnels would take on a new role, because the living were running out of room for the dead. By the mid-18th century, Paris faced a dire crisis. Its cemeteries, particularly the infamous Saints' Innocents, were so overcrowded that corpses were literally spilling into nearby buildings. The stench overpowering disease, inevitable. Something had to be done. In 1786, officials began exhuming millions of corpses from overflowing graveyards and relocating them into the abandoned quarries. Workers moved cartloads of bones under cover of night, a grim procession lit by torchlight.
The bones were dumped at first, then rearranged later into the haunting formations we see today. It wasn't just sanitation, it was spectacle. The result is a vast necropolis beneath a modern metropolis, a place where time stands still, where bones of plague, victims, revolutionaries, and medieval monks rest side by side. The catacombs don't just preserve the dead, they hold the memory of a city that has always teetered between beauty and decay. So while Paris above sparkles with elegance, below it sleeps silent, dark, and watching. By the mid-700s, Paris was running out of space, not for the living, but for the dead. Cemeteries had become overburdened to the point of collapse. Quite literally, the most infamous offender, the Chimère d'Eos, located in the center of the city. It had been in use for nearly 1,000 years, and had accumulated centuries of corpses, layer upon layer in shared graves, often stacked 6 or 7 deep as the population grew. So did the problem by the 18th century. The Innocents and other cemeteries had become bubbling pits of decay. The smell was inescapable, seeping into homes, churches, and markets. Residents near Saints Innocents complained of unbearable stench and frequent sickness. Meat spoiled faster, water tasted strange in some accounts. Walls of nearby basement began to crack and leak human remains. It wasn't just grotesque, it was dangerous. In 1763, King Louis XV issued a royal decree banning burials within the city. But the church resisted. Cemeteries were sacred ground. Bodies were to rest in consecrated soil. But by the 1780s, the situation had reached a tipping point after a cellar wall collapsed due to the weight of decomposing bodies on the other side. Public health officials demanded a solution. The dead could no longer stay above ground. Enter the abandoned limestone quarries. These underground chambers, remnants of Paris's building boom, were mostly unused, dark, cold, and far from the eyes of the city, perfect for a mass relocation of human remains. In 1786, authorities began transferring bones from Saints Innocents to the subterranean network. The work was conducted at night out of public view. Workers wore long robes, and the carts of bones were draped in black cloth. Priests accompanied the processions, chanting the rites of the dead. It was equal parts grim and reverent. The transfer of bodies continued for decades. Other cemeteries were emptied too. Saint-Étienne-de-Grès, Madeleine, and Montmartre among them, as more bones filled the tunnels. Officials began arranging them into patterns, both to save space and to provide a somber sense of order. This crisis, born of too many dead and too little land, created one of the world's most chilling monuments. The catacombs weren't just a solution. They were a reminder that even in death, the city must be managed. Step into the worry section of hidden entrances, manholes in parks, storm drains, or basement trapdoors. Once inside, they navigate by memory, hand-drawn maps, or intuition. There are no signs, no safety rails, and no cell service, only the sound of your own footsteps echoing through the dark. This isn't just thrill-seeking for many cataphiles. The catacombs are a second city, a sacred space of history, rebellion, and creativity. Over decades, they've carved out rooms in the tunnels, makeshift libraries, art galleries, and even cinemas. Some host clandestine parties, deep underground generators, speakers, and candlelight illuminating a dance floor built over stacked bones. The cataphile community is tight-knit and fiercely protective. Entry is often by invitation. Only newcomers, called tourists, are often tested for respect and survival skills. The golden rule: never disturb the bones, never tag sacred sites, and never get caught, because this is all illegal in 1955. French authorities declared all unofficial exploration of the catacombs prohibited. The risks were and are real. The tunnels are unstable in places, prone to collapse. Some are flooded. Others are filled with tight crawl spaces,
and dead ends that can disorient even seasoned explorers over the years, there have been injuries, arrests, and even deaths. In one notorious case, a man went missing for days and was found delirious in a remote section, guided out only by search dogs. Despite the dangers, the city's catacombs, the Catholics struggle to stop the trespassing. The system is simply too vast. Every time a known entrance is sealed, a new one is found. The cataphiles return. They always return for them. The catacombs are more than bones. They are freedom mystery. A place where Paris breathes differently, where time dissolves and where the living walk alongside the dead, not in fear, but in reverence, wandered deep enough into the Paris catacombs, and the silence gives way not to voices, but to symbols, messages scratched into limestone, cryptic arrows, names, faces, cryptic poetry, and fading paint. This is the language of the tunnels, a tapestry of graffiti signs and secret codes left by generations of cataphiles, workers, soldiers, and the dead. Some of the oldest markings come from quarrymen, centuries before the catacombs became a burial site. These early miners carved dates, initials, and directional arrows into the walls to track where they'd been. Many engraved their names, with pride, like time-stamped signatures in the earth. Others marked exits, stone quality, or left sketches, simple images of pickaxes, candles, even ships. These weren't just idle doodles, they were survival tools in a lightless maze. Once the catacombs became an ouari, a new language emerged, carved plaques from the 18th and 19th centuries that label which cemetery the bones came from. Some include haunting epigs. Where is death always behind you? Others quote scripture or Latin maxims about the vanity of life and the certainty of death, but deeper in the forbidden zones. Modern hands have added their own voice. Cataphile graffiti flourished in the 20th century. Some pieces are artistic masterpieces, elaborate murals painted by flashlight, entire walls transformed into glowing skeletons, mythical beasts or surreal portraits. Other markings are practical arrows pointing toward known exits, nicknames etched into stone or coded directions, like G.V. Chalik, 30 men to Montourage. The tunnels have their own unofficial map. An oral ketography passed among cataphil's locations bear cryptic names: the beach, a sand-filled cavern, the cellar, the cathedral, the sandbox. Some walls are nicknamed for the images on them: the mushroom forest, the elephant room. Without this insider knowledge, getting lost isn't just possible. It's almost guaranteed. There are also marks of occupation, candle holders carved into walls, benches made of scavenged stone, rusted hinges where makeshift doors once stood. Some explorers bring stencils or ink stamps marking their visits, like underground passports. Others leave behind poems, bottle caps, or small figurines, quiet offerings to a world of eternal night. In the catacombs, language becomes legacy. Every scroll, every arrow, every whisper in paint is part of an evolving chronicle, telling us someone was here, someone passed through, and someone wanted to be remembered. During times of war, the Paris catacombs were more than a macabre curiosity. They became a battlefield in the shadows beneath the streets. While bombs fell and regimes shifted, above the catacombs served as shelter, hideout, and strategic weapon. For centuries, they've been a part of Paris's wartime story. Quiet, secretive, and essential during the French Revolution, bones were still being transferred underground, but the tunnels were already becoming more than storage. As the guillotine claimed heads by day, the catacombs absorbed the mounting remains. By night, rumors swirled that revolutionaries used the tunnels to move undetected across the city. Plotting in the dark, these passages weren't just for the dead. They were tactical. In World War II, the catacombs entered a new chapter of intrigue. When Nazi Germany occupied Paris in 1940, The Wehrmacht and the SS mapped sections of the catacombs for military use. In one infamous case, a bunker was constructed beneath the Les Montagnes right within the tunnel system, hidden from the Allies. It served as a command post, complete with reinforced walls, supply storage, and communication lines. But the resistance was watching. The French resistance, ever resourceful, also used the catacombs underneath enemy-controlled Paris. They navigated these tunnels with expert knowledge, staging ambushes, smuggling weapons, and conducting meetings in the echoing dark. It was a game of subterranean cat and mouse. One level below the Nazis, French fighters moved like ghosts. The cataphiles of the time, those already familiar with the unofficial sections, became invaluable. Their knowledge of hidden entrances and obscure routes turned the catacombs into a guerrilla labyrinth. Some sections still show evidence of their presence. Resistance graffiti remains of ration cans and even defensive structures built into the stone bomb shelters were carved during air raids. Ordinary citizens sometimes fled to the tunnels during Allied bombings or Nazi crackdowns down there in the stillness. Families waited bones on one side, war above hope somewhere in between. After the war, many of these wartime sections were sealed off or forgotten, but traces remain: a rusted door, a pile of gas mask filters, a scorched wall. The catacombs held secrets long before the 20th century. But in wartime, they became something more: a crucible of survival resistance and the quiet defiance of a city that refused to die, where there are bones and darkness. Legends follow. The Paris catacombs are no exception over the centuries. These tunnels have become the breeding ground for myths, ghost stories, and urban legends that blur the line between reality and nightmare. Once a burial solution, the catacombs now host a folklore of their own, one that continues to grow with every new echo in the dark. One of the most famous tales is that of the Phantom of the Catacombs. Some say it's a long-deaded quarryman who got lost and now wanders the tunnels. His footsteps heard, but never seen. Others claim he's a plague victim, cursed to roam the Oi, forever seeking his lost family among the 6 million skulls. Whether ghost or metaphor, visitors and explorers alike have reported disembodied whispers, cold gusts of air, and sudden nausea in certain sections of the tunnels, especially near older, untouched quarries. Then there's the legend of the camcorder tape. In the early 1990s, a group of catphiles allegedly found a video camera deep in a restricted section. The footage, later broadcast on French television, showed a man wandering alone through the tunnels, increasingly panicked, running, spinning, lost. Eventually, he drops the camera. No one knows who he was or what happened to him. The clip ends in silence, and he was never identified. The story became modern myth, the lost explorer who never found the surface again. Other stories are more surreal. There are whispered accounts of rooms filled with human bones, arranged into chairs and thrones, or of underground cults using the catacombs for rituals. One sealed chamber discovered in the early 2000s had a working phone line, a fully stocked bar, and an underground cinema on the wall. A chilling message: do not try to find us. Despite skepticism, the power of the catacombs mythos is undeniable. It feeds on the natural fear of the dark, the unknown, and the sheer weight of death. The space is real, but the stories, they live in the gaps between candlelight and shadow, between echoes and silence. Whether you believe the tales or not, one thing is certain: deep beneath Paris, fear breathes easily, and the catacombs never sleep today. The catacombs of Paris are one of the city's strangest and most visited attractions each year. Hundreds of thousands descend into this empire of death, not for funerals or rituals, but for curiosity, for selfies with skulls, for the thrill of standing among 6 million of the once living. It's a place where mortality is laid bare, Yet marketed with a ticket stub and a brochure, the official Ueri opened to the public in 1809 was originally intended to be a place of reflection, a memento mori for a city, too focused on the surface. Early visitors were guided through by lantern light, sometimes accompanied by priests or scholars. Today the lighting is brighter, the walls more secure, but the feeling remains a quiet awe, a dread mixed with wonder. Tourism has only grown since the 19th century. Poets, philosophers, and artists have long been drawn to the catacombs. Victor Hugo wandered its depths for inspiration. Salvador Dali called it beautiful. And for many, it's become a pilgrimage, not just to confront death, but to marvel at how meticulously death has been organized, stacked, and displayed. Yet the catacombs remain controversial. Critics argue that turning mass graves into tourist attractions is disrespectful, reducing human lives to decor others. Point out that few visitors realize what they're seeing. These aren't props. They're people, real individuals once, with names, faces, families now. Anonymous relics of a buried past. Still, the catacombs serve a powerful purpose. They remind us of scale, the sheer number of lives lived before us. They are quite literally the foundation of Paris. The dead supporting the living bones that once carried bread books, or revolution, now hold up the city's myths and sidewalks. But strangely, the moment you climb the staircase and return to the surface, Paris feels different, louder, brighter, more alive. Because in the end, the catacombs don't glorify death. They sharpen our sense of life, its fragility, its brevity, and its beauty. Beneath Paris lies its deepest truth. Everything we build on bones, and someday, perhaps the city will add ours to the archive.